Welcome once again to the Influencers Podcast. We are here to see the influence of your life grow. That you have been equipped by your Father to be a victor. Hi, my friend. Scott Young here with the Influencers Podcast, and we are so glad that you have joined us today. Lots happening in the world, and we want you to be a part of the world, not just sit as a casual observer, but to get involved in the world, to make it a better place, to increase the influence of your life, to be light in a dark world, hope to the hopeless, and really bring truth. We really need truth. You know, a lot of things are changing in our world, and we're going to be talking about some of that today. Do you know that people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, or something other than heterosexual has had a vast increase in recent years? It's over doubled in just the last decade, according to Gallup. It's especially high among young adults. Well, today's guest is going to be talking about that, and he's going to be telling his story. Really, the fallacy of being true to yourself was a fallacy. Here's what Garry says. Authentic hope is not found in discovering your truth, but rather there is one truth, and that truth comes from God alone. Garry and Melissa Ingraham live in Phoenix, Arizona, where it is hot and dry. They have founded the Love and Truth Network, which really works to help to restore people to sexual wholeness and biblical identity. Both he and his wife have come out of identity confusion. They have now been married. They have 2 sons, and Garry is the author of a book called Am I Gay? The subtitle is rather long. Coming out of a cultural Christianity and an LGBTQ plus identity into authentic faith in Jesus. One of the things he does is to help parents, and you may be listening today and you may need to lean in a little bit, to help parents with their children when they struggle with identity issues. And Garry, I want to thank you for joining us on the Influencers Podcast and just unpack a little bit of your story, a little bit of your journey so people can know who we're listening to today.
Sure. Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. Yeah, my story begins, I was born and raised in a Christian home. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. I have 1 older sister and 3 brothers. And really from the earliest of my memories, I felt as though I didn't fit in really in the family. I felt as though I didn't quite belong. And a lot of that was connected to the fact that my parents thought they were done having kids when my next oldest sibling, 5 years older than me, had been born. And so when my mom was 42 and she found out she was pregnant, my dad was 44. They weren't too happy about that. But fast forward, my mom really came around to love me well. My dad, I think my dad loved me as much as he knew how, but was still kind of resentful and frustrated, I think, that they were having another child. So Dad and I became very close friends later in life, much, much later in life, for probably 20, 25 years. But we were very, very close. But for those formative years growing up, it wasn't that way at all. So there was that situation, going to church as far back as I can remember, hearing a lot of truth poured in. But I think going to a pretty typical kind of church that teaches a lot of truth, but doesn't really shepherd the hearts of children and even adults terribly well. There's a lot of behavior management. There's a lot of do's and don'ts. And I think those play a role, a very important role. But the shepherding of the heart, the relationship, the connection, dads particularly paying attention to winning the hearts of their children, sons and daughters, and bringing them into the faith relationally, I think is so essential. I didn't get that. My siblings didn't get that. And for me, couple that with early sexual exposure, early pornography exposure, older neighborhood boys' sexual behavior, and abuse at the age of 5 or 6 for me. And it really set me up on a path that brought about a lot of gender identity confusion.
So when you say shepherding the heart, there's a dad listening right now, there's a mom listening, and they hear that turmoil. There's a pastor listening. How could I be better at shepherding someone's heart rather than just teaching a long list of do this and don't do that?
Well, it's about doing life together. Shepherding the heart takes time. It's part of discipleship. But discipleship that I grew up with was more of sit down and here's the didactic theological truths that you need to know and believe, as opposed to how does that relate to you? What do you think about that? What causes you to wrestle with that theological truth? Those kinds of things, and to have that kind of give and take relationally, those are so important. And again, I'm not talking about minimizing truth at all. I think we need to have a higher value of truth and God's truth, but we also need to couple that with a high level of relationship and drawing out. I mean, kids don't. I think kids often naturally feel ashamed or wrong about how they might feel about something, especially if they think it disagrees with the leadership or their mom or dad. And so they kind of keep it inside. And I think it's moms do this, I think, a little bit more naturally, quite a bit more so. But I think it's really important for dads, especially, to draw out those deep waters to know where their sons and daughters are at. And I just hear over and over and over again from adult children who grew up in a Christian home who just look back on that and didn't really experience that kind of nurture in their Christian developmental experience.
So then you came to have some identity issues in your sexuality. I don't know, how old were you when that kind of became a part of your life, and how long was it a part of your life? And
Yep. Yeah, good question. So I'd say it was around puberty, after I was exposed to hardcore pornography by some older neighborhood boys that their dad had laying around. It was just very disturbing to me at a young age, and yet also intriguing in a way too. But as I matured and moved into puberty, and I could get my hands on pornography. I mean, back then the internet wasn't around, and I'm so grateful for that, actually. But when I at some point I recall being aware, I feel more drawn toward images of men than toward women. And when I realized that was horrifying to me. I began to pray and I knew I shouldn't be doing any of these things, but early on the same-sex attraction realization hit. But chronic masturbation and pornography use was something that was just had become a means of coping with life, and with also a lot of bullying in school. I was, whether it was school, oftentimes church as well. There was just bullying or a sense of being pushed out of the world of boys and men because I just wasn't your stereotypical kind of, country boy growing up in upstate New York. And so all of that kind of fed into none of that was determinative. I mean, that didn't make me gay or any of that, but it did create the soil in which I think the seeds of sexual addiction certainly happened. And then at the same time, confusion about my own identity, which grew over time, even with Bible college and, all of that grew over time to a point that at 19 years old, I found my first gay bar and felt like, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. This finally makes sense. I finally belong somewhere. And that was a really powerful and strong kind of euphoria delusion for several years of living into that. But I'd experienced those feelings from as, pretty early age.
But you said when you were growing up, you felt you didn't fit in.
Right.
So how did all of a sudden you found a tribe, you found a group of people
right.
that you did feel like you belonged. So how did that play into each other, the feeling of being ostracized or not fitting in, even inside your family? And all of a sudden there's another socio group, gay bar, and you did fit in. How does that fit together?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a great word that you use, the word tribe. We were created for a deep, deep sense of belonging. And that doesn't just automatically happen, even in Christian families. It doesn't automatically happen in church. It's something that has to be nurtured, and adults have to initiate toward children and continue to do that. And so, but that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to do that well, I think. So when I finally, through much of the bullying and the rejection of other boys, I was terrible at gym class and sports, and the locker room was always a nightmare. But every day,
ask about the bullying. Did they bully you and call you gay?
Yeah. So I heard fag, sissy, queer, every day, books knocked out of my hands in the hallway. It was getting threatened at the locker, trying to just get my, but yeah, all that was just a daily kind of experience. Or if it wasn't, I was always braced for that constantly. And then the gym class in the locker room were just that times, whatever, constant failure as a boy is what it felt like to me. So.
So now when you're talking to parents and they've got young boys, or I guess Melissa went through some of this.
She did.
Girls, and they are struggling with sexual identity like you were and have. What do you say to parents to sort of help them create an environment? Because there's this whole nurture, like what plays against what, but how do we do our best to create an environment? And that's one of the words that you use, to create an environment for a healthy sexual expression.
Yeah, great question. And I think that in our families, we have the opportunity as moms and dads to really nurture children and to start at an early age. So we're working on an e-course and some curriculum right now that for parents, but there's two main focuses. One is on prevention and the other is on recovery. And we know that sometimes parents with older kids and young kids, they're kind of in the middle of both of those places. But we would love especially to connect with young parents who have little kids, and for dads especially, moms too, but for dads especially, to learn the important role that they have in the early development of their children, and that sense of building into them that strong sense of goodness of their identity as little boys, little girls, made in the image of God as little boys and little girls, different expressions of his image, but of equal value. And how do we really live into that? How can we prepare our children to know that they actually have an identity which is precious and is intended for good, so that when they are exposed to these other alternative so-called alternative identities, they actually have this sense of, oh, I already have this strong sense of who I am and this good sense of who I am. I don't even need to pick that up. Most Christian kids growing up in a Christian home, we've not really even given them anything within that equips them to understand their own sense of identity as 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. Until you go to a school, and their schools are often asking daily or weekly, what do you identify as today? And that's very intentionally meant to cause a child to think about things that they don't even need to, like, it's assumed, of course they know that they're a boy or a girl typically, but it's to stir up these questions and doubts and wonderings. And then you see all the celebration going on as well. And I'm getting off into a whole other arena you weren't even asking about, Scott. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
But yeah.
Well, so we did start by talking about the increase in sociological studies, that there's this increase. And how are people increasing in their sexual orientation if it's a normative thing, simply from nature? There has to be some nurture, some environmental issues there. That's what you're talking about.
I am. So, yes, for sure.
You've also, Gary, you've mentioned several times dads, fatherhood.
Yes.
And the importance, and you're a dad.
I am.
What kind of dad do you want to be now to your kids? And what kind of dads will help to create healthy homes?
Well, again, I think it's important that boys and girls, in terms of part of their natural God-given need for individuation as they get older, they need space. For sure. But most kids, even in Christian homes, are given way too much secretive space, where there's the mom and dads especially, are not even curious about what's going on in the hearts of their children and how they're processing, again, biblical truth, something that might have happened at church, their quiet time, their devotion. So I really want my boys to know that I care deeply, that they hear me say, I love you. I'm so proud to be your dad. I can't believe I get to be your father. It's such a gift from God. At the same time, I'm also a very clear disciplinarian when there's issues, So a word that I really appreciate that flows out of this program we've been involved in called Living Waters, put out by Andrew Kaminsky and Desert Stream Ministries. One of the words Andrew has used for fathers is the word salient. We need fathers who are going to be salient, meaning that they are both strong and tender, that we have the capacity to have both of those things, and that we press into relationship, we draw our children out, and they know us, and they know of our failures. And when I say failures, I don't mean that we tell our children everything, but they know that we've been through challenges and that we've failed, and God has picked us up and cleaned us off, and we go back to the cross, and we need people, men in our lives, as dads, that we can be accountable to and do life with. And moms need women in their lives that they're doing life with. And you guys need to learn to grow up and open up to others. So I think the modeling, as well as that very intentional pursuit of their hearts, is so critical for dads to really understand that there's such a value to that in raising their sons and daughters.
So you have sons or sons and daughters?
I have two boys.
You have two boys, and they're
Yes.
how old?
They will be 15 next month and 13 in July.
So when did you start talking to them about sexuality?
Well, I started talking with them about what I felt like was a foundation for healthy sexuality when they were very little, meaning talking about God's design in terms of our image, talking about God's design for male and female, that it's good and it's wholesome, and God's intention is that we bless the image of God and the other. Those kinds of things we talked about when they were 6, 7, 8 years old, and it was just kind of peppered throughout our conversations. But when they got older, probably 10, 11. So part of the question we have to ask ourselves is, where are our children at in school? If my children had been in public school, I would have had to talk to them about sex when they were 5 and 6 years old, because they're getting this stuff pushed on them at those early ages. We homeschooled them and are homeschooling them. We're doing a classical model of education, which is very rigorous. But one of the reasons we're homeschooling them is for the rigorous educational model, but also so that we could let them enjoy their innocence for as long as possible without all of this having to even deal with this stuff. So I told my oldest son about my own story of homosexuality and the brokenness around that. I told him about that shortly after his 12th birthday. And then my youngest son, I told about that same age for him too, maybe 11 and a half, maybe 12. But again, not getting into unnecessary gory detail, but being clear. The boys knew that my life had been a train wreck in a lot of ways. And that isn't just about homosexuality. Lots of us have had train wrecks, and they knew that, but the details they didn't need to know until they were at an appropriate age.
So you were 19 in a gay bar.
Yes.
What was your journey from that experience? You defined yourself as gay, I imagine, to now come to where you are in the book you've written, Am I Gay? Talk about that journey.
Yeah, so it was euphoric to begin with, and feeling like I was wanted for the first time in my life. I finally belonged somewhere. I wasn't mocked or ridiculed for the way that I just kind of was or behaved or whatever. And so it was a huge relief in a lot of ways. But my desire was, I'm going to find Mr. Right, and I'm going to settle down with him for the rest of my life, and white picket fences and all this kind of thing. And in my mind, but that ship sailed within weeks after finding my first gay bar, and I very quickly got into this revolving door of thinking it was going to be a relationship, and then it wound up being a one night stand or 2 or 3 or 4. Pardon me. Yeah, I thought and thinking that it would be a one night stand, and then it wound up being sorry, let me rephrase that. Thinking that it was going to.
You can take it. You can take a drink of water too. Just take a break. Take a drink of water. Clear your throat.
Yeah, sorry about that. For some reason, I'm tickled.
No, and I'm going to ask you a question that's going to lead you into the next segment. Ready? Okay. So you write about sexuality was like a drug to you, crack cocaine to you, and they say physiologically, sex is like cocaine. How did you break that addiction the one night stands, the short, not the white picket fence experience?
Right. Well, it just finally it became. I began to realize that I was feeling this rot and decay of my soul. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 6:18, and the way that sexual sin impacts us differently than other kinds of sin. And I was feeling that, and so it took some time, and then it also took a long time for me to even connect the dots as to what was going on. So I even though it was euphoric for a period of time, it started to really dwindle, the glitz and the glamour of it in a sense, and I began to feel like an old man in the prime of my life, in my early 20s, and then at the same time, I had become so bitter and angry with God and the church because there were no answers. I felt like God demands that we do certain things, but then does nothing to actually help us. That's how I felt at the time. And then I began to also wonder, well, God, why aren't you just killing me? Why aren't you taking me out? And when he didn't do that, I began to wonder, well, maybe my perception about God and how much of an ogre or slave master he is, maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's not exactly who he is. And it just started with this kind of gradual opening of more kind of a positive possibility with God. And then also seeing the gay world, the longer I was in it, that it was anything but gay, and that it was not at all what I thought it actually was. And so over the course of time, those things kind of collided, and God really did reveal himself to me as one who was faithful and pursued me, had never left me, but was in pursuit of me, and was waiting for me to wear myself out and come to a place of surrender, which is what I talk about toward the end of the book.
So I think that was very powerful when you said, and there's people that are listening right now on the platform that identify when you said, God gives us these rules and then does nothing to help it, because they prayed. Oh, God.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God, take away my gayness. Oh, God, take away my rampant heterosexuality, which is just as bad. It's the same thing. This crack cocaine of sexuality.
Yep.
Okay, well, God, where are you to help me? So was it a revelation of God that you began to be healed? What were the steps to your healing? Because somebody's listening to you going, what can I do? What can I read? What can I pray? Because they've tried things.
Yeah, so the missing ingredient for me in terms of, I think, really coming into the kingdom of God, I grew up as a religious kid, and I prayed the sinner's prayer a number of times as a kid, and even as a teenager. But the missing ingredient was surrender. I mean, that, in the end of the book, that was the thing that actually was the life change that God had been waiting for, was me to surrender to him, and the good, the bad, the ugly. And when I did that, I mean, that really is what produced new life in me. That's where the Holy Spirit moved in. And it was a radically different experience from then on, from what I had grown up with as just this religious kid trying to do the right things, but without the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, and just my flesh trying to improve itself in a sense. And, so that was huge. And that changed a lot of things. But I also, our ministry focuses primarily on equipping the church and pastors, because we believe the church is the one place that has answers on this. And so it's really all about this journey of discipleship. It's about us learning to open up to one another, tearing down the masks of shame and pride and fear of exposure, and finding a band of brothers, a band of sisters, a church community. The church is full of people who are living double lives. The church is full sexual immorality for sure, men, women in the pulpit, but all kinds of other brokenness. There's very few Christians that aren't living double lives. And that's a recipe for disaster. And so that is a primary message of our church. So surrender is essential, but then we also need to find a healthy community. What I refer to them as are teaching hospital churches. There's lots of churches that just want to do church and want to do the form and function of church. But then there's churches that want to roll up their sleeves and get into the muck and mire with broken people and equip them to become the next level of nurses and doctors. And those are the kind of church communities that I think are so relevant in our day and time.
I loved what you just said when you said a teaching hospital church. Those were three good words to put together. And if there's some Christian leaders that are listening to us, how can they connect with you to get these resources? Maybe they say, hey, we'd like to grow in the area of becoming a teaching hospital church. How do they connect with your resources, Garry?
Well, and it all starts with a conversation with me, getting on our website first and seeing, the resources that are there. So loveandtruthnetwork.com is our website. And then we do a weekly podcast as well, talking about all of these issues and doing interviews with lots of different people, detransitioners, people coming out of the LGBT world, pastors, people coming out of sexual brokenness, moms and dads as well, learning how to go, that have gone through, years of walking with children that have been off in the weeds, et cetera. And that's simply loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast for the video and audio, or you can pick up our podcast on any of the major podcast platforms.
What a joy to have you on, Garry. I rejoice with you at the freedom you've found from surrender. I really pray it will encourage people that are listening to surrender. That's the secret. In spiritual life, power comes through surrender, not through domination or control, but through surrender. Yes. So I love that. And I want to thank you for being a part of the Influencers podcast. I want to thank all our friends who have joined us for this conversation. And you may want to pass on this conversation. I know some friends that have kids that have said, I'm gay. And we want to pass on hope to them. And Garry, you've given us a lot of hope. I want to thank you very much for that. Thanks for joining us. And all of our friends. No, thank you. Please, friends, shine where you are. Be an influence where you are. Be light in a dark world. And thanks for being a part of the Influencers today. I'm Scott Young. Keep the faith. Keep your eyes on Jesus. And keep surrendered.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Influencers podcast on the Charisma Podcast Network.
If you enjoy our content, we would love for you to subscribe and have the opportunity to tune in to future podcasts. You can follow us on all social media platforms at the Influencers Podcast Official. You can stay up to date, hear more inspiring content, and unlock your full potential as an influencer.
Remember to use your influence to create lasting change that draws the world closer to Jesus.